Nicole Guerin is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the Faculty of Architecture, Design and Planning at the University of Sydney. Her work focuses on comparative land use planning systems and approaches to housing and ecological sustainability. She's been at the University of Sydney since 2002, and hitherto she practiced as a planner in the New South Wales State Government with responsibility for local environmental plan making, environmental management and housing policy. Nicole has led or collaborated on several recent studies related to planning the housing system, notably for the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, known as AHURI to its friends, I think, on subjects such as affordable housing and urban renewal, planning system performance and housing reform, planning government charges and the cost of owning housing. She also has led studies on for the National Sea Change Task Force. The Sea Change Task Force actually refers to the fact that people in Australia like to retire to coastal areas, and this has obviously impacts for those areas, the issues around housing. So one of her interests is the rapid growth of peri and non-metropolitan communities in Australia. Her book, Australian Land Use Planning, Principles, Systems and Practice, published by Sydney University Press, is now in its second edition and is a key source for anyone interested in the planning system in Australia. Nicole also contributes to regularly to public policy debates around these issues, particularly issues of housing affordability in Sydney and in New South Wales. Nicole is working currently with Nick Gallant of BSP and Rebecca Chu from the University of Hong Kong, looking at housing supply outcomes in 3 different planning cultures and contexts, but places which are dissimilar in some respects, but have similar demand pressures. And I believe there's a book just recently emerged from this study. So we've asked Nicole to speak this evening about housing and planning, especially questions of housing affordability in Sydney. Why? Well, firstly, because Sydney is an intrinsically interesting place, and it's always worth hearing about. But secondly, as no doubt we will learn, there are important common challenges facing planners in the planning system in Sydney and London. Housing affordability looms large as a political issue in both places. But also in both places, there's the suggestion from some political quarters that the problem arises from the failure of the planning system to supply sufficient land and housing. There are, of course, important differences between the UK and Australia, including different settlement patterns and structures of government. But of course, that doesn't mean we can't learn lessons from experiences elsewhere, so long as we do so carefully. So hearing about the Sydney experience and likely developments in the UK in general and London in particular seems very worthwhile. So following the lecture, as is our custom, there will be a reception with wine and something to eat just outside in the Roberts foyer, so if you have the time and the inclination, please do join us afterwards. So my final task is to say to Nicole, welcome to London, welcome to UCL, welcome to the Bartlett. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Dom, for that very extended and comprehensive introduction. I think you set the scene very well. And thanks, Nick, in particular, for the invitation to speak to you tonight. Nick asked me to throw in a little bit about planning, a bit about politics and a bit about the global housing market, and I'll do so. And I will talk primarily about Australia. But just to set Australia in the international context, the IMF released this graph just last month now, and it selectively shows countries that are bust countries, bust and boom countries. Australia is pretty much in the boom category, which means we've had an extended period of house price inflation, nearly 2 decades now. We're in the company of countries like Canada and Hong Kong. The UK, bust and boom in the company of countries like Ireland and the US. And what that means, both for bust and boom countries, of course, but certainly for boom countries like Australia, is housing affordability pressures. And the The one that's received the most headlines and the most political traction in Australia at least is the notion that home ownership is falling out of reach for younger generations. And this comment from our Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull is pretty much representative of the position that governments have had in relation to housing affordability pressures over the entire boom period for about 15 years, is that housing affordability pressures are due to not enough homes being built, which in turn are due to constraints in the land use planning system. And so as a planner who teaches planners and someone who also is a researcher in housing policy, this type of accusation about the planning system is very serious and warrants deep investigation. And so I've dedicated a lot of my research career actually to trying to nut out this problem around planning and housing affordability and whether planning is in fact to blame for Australia's chronic supply and certainly affordability problems. So tonight I want to use three frames to investigate this proposition. And the first uses the frame of comparative urban and housing research, and this is what Nick and I and Rebecca used in our recent book, and I'll draw on that in a moment. And comparative housing studies is useful because by shining a light on other countries, you can often learn something about your own country. And I certainly learned quite a bit about Australia when I compared it to England and to Hong Kong. And essentially it provides a systematic basis for understanding how historically evolved systems of urban governance and housing provision come to delimit the sort of contemporary status quo. And it asks whether those historical reasons for, in a sense, the contemporary state of affairs, whether they set you on a path dependency in which, it's not possible to deviate, or whether countries like Australia, England, Ireland, America are actually converging in their response to shared global problems like rising social inequality and the neoliberal political movement and environmental problems and so on. So there's deep debates about whether your historical background sets you on a path which you can't deviate from, or whether in fact countries are heading in the same direction. Then there's a second set of arguments which I'm labelling here the empirical debates about planning in the housing market, and they range from very, very difficult to understand sort of statistical models that prove planning is to blame, to some of the types of evidence that planners might look at and assess and understand, yes, in this particular instance, planning is acting as a constraint for housing supply. So I want to ask the question, empirically, what is the evidence base to show in Australia's case whether or not planning is the reason for supply and affordability issues? And the last question I want to ask is whether actually we have a political problem in Australia which explains why so consistently in Australia at least our governments have pursued policy solutions to housing problems which are demonstrably ineffective. So to take the comparative frame to start with, as I said, comparative research can help you clarify, your own issues by sort of throwing a spotlight on them. They also help you learn from another place by understanding how other places are different and how they might be similar. So a kind of informed process of policy learning. And the method asks you to pay very systematic attention to the way that systems evolve historically. Systems of urban governance, housing provision, property rights, settlement structure and politics. And so if we apply this lens to Australia, we see a country since white settlement, which evolved very much as a place for English and Irish people to realise their dreams of home ownership, actually, freedom from landlords, freedom from government regulation. I mean, let's face it, we're a penal colony. And it was also a place of abundant space as well. And so with those notions, you can kind of understand how urban settlement evolved in Australia. Certainly speculative suburban development was the nation-building recipe in Australia. It was encouraged. The market really drove urbanisation, and very rapid urbanisation in Australia. And it also happened as a kind of dialectic between the inner cities, which were controlled. We had early fire regulations, early health and sanitation regulations, just like England, maybe 10 years later by the time things arrived over by boat. But we had building control and planning control from the very early years. And we also had land developers who moved beyond those inner city regulated areas in search of places where it was cheaper to build and avoid those regulations. And by the sort of early 20th century, we had a very, very strong building industry, property industry, which was very well versed in avoiding and arguing against new modern town planning rules, which it said building health and other regulations make it impossible, essentially, to build a home at a price that a worker could afford. So planning has really been ruining it for home ownership in Australia since the year dot. Australia was pretty late to discover organised housing assistance policies. In the wake of the Second World War, we faced a crisis in housing supply, much like the United Kingdom and the United States. There hadn't been much house building going on for at least 20 years. And the Commonwealth government intervened and offered cheap loans to the state governments to build public housing, provided that the states enacted modern town planning laws and undertook slum clearance initiatives in the inner city, which they did. Meanwhile, Australia's private sector, and private builders and land speculators, very efficiently began to address the housing shortage. And so the role of the government in terms of house building was pretty peripheral to the main game. And this was suburban housing development. By the late 60s, early 70s, the housing supply problem had been totally addressed. And it was said that Australian builders by the 1980s could build in world terms, what was a very high quality house on its own garden, more cheaply and more efficiently almost than anywhere else in comparable countries. But housing policy was becoming increasingly detached from urban policy, and urban planners were only really interested in the physical regulation of the built form. In terms of public housing, this was the only place really where you saw density. It was in the public housing estates. And by the 1980s, early 1990s, increasingly public housing became really just a safety net for the poorest of the very poor. So you saw a very residualised public housing sector. Moving forward very quickly, we discovered growth management or urban containment by about the 1980s. Didn't really take off in the sort of public psyche until the 1990s. And it was a combination of three things. It was the state government realising that it could unlock valuable sites in the inner city. It was a period of no more funding, essentially, for infrastructure to support growth in the suburban areas. And it was also the discovery of the environmental agenda and a realisation that urban sprawl couldn't continue. And so we've had a period of a very controversial period of urban consolidation or containment, in which I think is the term that you use here. But despite this very strong spatial planning rhetoric around urban consolidation, in actual fact, the fabric of Australia's cities and suburbs is very much still the detached home. And indeed, even though in Sydney, which is a bit of an anomaly, 70% of new dwellings are apartments, flats and apartments, you still see, even in Sydney, half of the housing stock would still be like this. And certainly you're still seeing a lot of this being built on the outskirts of the capital cities. So to put Australia in comparison here, this is drawing from my book with Nick, so in comparison with England and Hong Kong, we've got very rapid population growth, nearly 2%, driven largely by international migration. Most of our population is in major cities. In fact, most people live in Sydney and Melbourne, really. But we have very low population density in world terms. We're about, we've got around, I think, a tenth of the density of London, for instance, in Sydney. And nationally, our house prices to earnings are relatively unaffordable, a little bit more affordable than England and Hong Kong. But in places like Sydney, the ratio is somewhere between 10 and 12. So very low housing affordability in the capital cities. In terms of our housing system, we are a home ownership society, but home ownership has been dropping from 70% to now about 67%. The balance is the private rental sector, and that is the very important sector of our housing system, and a minuscule social and affordable housing sector of somewhere around 3%, maybe a little bit higher than 3%. Housing is provided by the market, but it's generally not a form of speculative housing provision. We have land speculation by developers, but each dwelling before it's built will typically be contracted by the end purchaser before the housing is built. So we call that speculative land development, but not speculative house building. I've talked about the settlement pattern. Our planning system essentially is an amalgamation of the UK discretionary system and the American zoning and codification approach, with responsibility divided between the state and local government. In terms of funding for urban infrastructure and for things like hospitals and schools, that occurs between the Commonwealth and the states. Local governments are only really responsible for funding very local development services. And I think that's important, because what that means is that local communities don't have an inherent reason to resent growth, because they don't have to fund most of the infrastructure around population growth. So this is our system of housing production in comparison to England and Hong Kong. The bright blue is the non-profit. So you can see in comparison to England and Hong Kong, which has almost half housing in Hong Kong is produced as affordable housing by the government, less than 3% in Australia. But similarly, a very low level of speculative housing development in comparison to England and even in comparison to Hong Kong. In terms of the housing policy framework, then, we have a policy rhetoric that emphasises supply, the need for new supply. But we have a housing policy framework that's geared towards demand, and that is financial assistance towards renters as a top-up, a rental subsidy for people in the private rental market on low incomes. It's very generous, much more generous settings for taxation settings for homeowners and for property investors. Grants for homeowners, not very effective, but still grants for first homeowners, again a demand-side mechanism. A political attitude of a very welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, and indeed foreign investment has risen dramatically in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of Australian housing. And very limited, as I said, support on the supply side for social and affordable housing. So the idea has been, or the policy hope has been, that the demand side taxes and transfers and indeed demand from investors and foreign investors will result in new supply. But the reality has been rising prices. So yes, rising demand, but stagnant or relatively flat supply when looked over a long period of time. It's slightly different to the UK scenario in as much as supply hasn't dropped off a cliff, it's remained fairly stable. But even so, there's an apparent discrepancy between rising prices and housing output. And this has led, as I said before, to a period of prolonged soul searching and hand wringing about the number of new dwellings that are being produced, but more importantly, the deficit of homes that are affordable to people on low and moderate incomes. So there's estimated, based on demographic need, we estimate that the shortage of homes in Australia is perhaps 280,000, or that was the last estimate in 2013. But the shortage of homes that are affordable to people on the lowest incomes is almost half a million dwellings. That's much more important. Okay, so moving on to the next sort of frame to understand this issue. Obviously, in a system that's geared towards supporting demand, the planning system or any potential constraints to supply become much more important. And so I want to look now at the empirical evidence as to whether Australia's planning system is holding back a supply response. And we know from the empirical literature that planning systems can do this if they don't release enough land or if they're too restrictive in terms of the supply of permission for house building. Alternatively, of course, planning can and probably should raise demand, raise prices, because of improving amenity. You know, there's an amenity effect and there's also a certainty effect. So it can be difficult to distinguish between planning as a supply constraint and planning as actually, you know, making things better. I mean, let's face it, if planning was bringing down the price of housing, people would hate that too. You know, and sometimes that might balance itself out. But if you want to diagnose a system that is imposing a supply constraint, I think there's basically three things to look for. The first is whether land allocation is insufficient, given demographic and market demand. The second is if development controls are too restrictive, and I mean certainly in the United States there's a long history of planning controls being designed specifically to exclude different groups, different racial groups, different socio-economic groups from neighbourhoods, in part because neighbourhoods didn't want to fund the school extensions, and in part because they thought that social diversity would depress house prices. And so, you know, sometimes planning controls are used deliberately to be exclusionary. And the third sort of diagnostic tool is whether the planning process is genuinely too long or expensive, associated with unnecessary, you know, taxes and charges, etc. And there's a long and very solid literature about all of those things. So to understand whether they apply in Australia, you need to know a little bit about the Australian planning system, and I've condensed my book into, I think, 6 dot points. I probably won't even go through them all. But essentially, all you need to know is the state governs planning in Australia and the local government implement. As I said, we've got zones which make things certain, but we also have discretionary merit-based assessment, which would be familiar to British planners. In Australia, the zones provide certainty, what you can and can't do, and the merit assessment actually tips things in favour of the developers. If the zone says you can't do it, maybe the merit-based assessment will say you can. Okay? It's a bit different to the United States in that respect. The state sets metropolitan spatial planning policy. We've had the policy emphasis, as I said, on urban containment, which is a possible clue as to land supply constraint, but it's been balanced, I will argue, and I think I'll show you, by ongoing greenfield development and release of land. We've got very limited capacity to capture value when planning rules are varied, or even when land is converted from rural to urban use. And that has meant very limited provision in the system to ensure affordable homes are included as part of new development. So very little comparable to the Section 106 mechanism, for instance, in the UK. And we've had about a decade of reforms designed to address things like land supply constraints, things like excessive environmental, development control problems, and all of the annoying things about planning processes that they take too long and they're uncertain and inconsistent, etc. And I'll show you some of those reforms in a moment. But what I want to do first is just look at Sydney as the case and look at the way in which spatial policy and policy around housing supply and diversity has played out over about a 15 to 20 year period. And I'm going to draw on 2 case studies that are in the book that I've done with Nick and Rebecca. And these two case studies basically are emblematic of the supply and housing diversity agenda of the New South Wales state government, which is pretty similar to the other states in Australia. And essentially that is in inner city areas contained urban renewal, high density development. And so my first case study is the star right in the middle of Sydney. And the other is a sort of reimagined suburban idyll, which is well-planned, walkable, diverse suburban development on the fringe, accessible to the city. And that's Rouse Hill, the star up at the top, which is the northwest of Sydney. We've had this very coherent, concentrated spatial planning approach, but in actual fact, land's been released everywhere anyway. Because the real agenda is just to enable supply, and that is argued that that will deliver affordability. But I'm going to focus anyway on those two emblematic sort of case studies. But just in the back of your mind, know that land is anyway being released for housing everywhere across the entire city. So the first one is this sort of suburban idyll. This was promoted in the 1990s when people were really facing the fact that sprawl couldn't continue, but no one wanted to let go of that, that wonderful car-based suburbia with everyone having their own, garden and all of that I showed you at the start. So Rouse Hill was thought to be the place where you could do both. You could have walkability, you could have diversity, you could have a centre, but you could also have suburbia. So detailed planning began in the late 1990s. The state acquired the site many years before that, but waited till the market was ready before it started to do detailed planning and rezoning and starting to do land release. In partnership, very heavy partnership with the private sector, but also many different state government agencies. The housing yield was anticipated to be around 1,800 dwellings plus a mixed-use town centre. There's a primary school, a high school, bus transit, and now they've also got a metro rail. This is what it looks like. The rail isn't finished, but it's coming in. It was very revolutionary to have shop-top housing in 65 kilometres from, well, it's probably not that far, but almost that from central Sydney. This was very radical. The other radical thing about this case was that the town centre went in before the houses. Was pretty dramatic. But in terms of delivering against the targets, it proceeded according to plan, and in fact the housing supply outcomes have almost doubled actually from the original expectation. And indeed, the planning now suggests that there's additional capacity for some further densification, even though it's quite a new suburb. This is the sort of thing that you see. Lots of interest. It's attractive to the Chinese market as well, which is presumably important in terms of delivering our supply nowadays. And I'll get back and I'll show you in a little bit more analytical detail in a moment in terms of the diversity outcomes and the price points. But the other case is the inner city one, inner city urban renewal, Green Square, Victoria Park. Detailed planning again began in the 1990s, a little bit later. There was an announcement that a new rail line would be built between the airport and the CBD. And so this area was right on the rail line, prime for intensification. It was supposed to show Australians, very sceptical Australians, that density could work, that it could be okay to live in an apartment. And the local council worked very closely with state government, and a special development corporation was formed. Later, it was the state land developer that took it over. Actually, the state land developer did Rouse Hill as well. Here, the dwelling targets were around about 20,000 new homes, 40,000 residents by 2031. We're well on the way. That's been half built out. Now, the estimate is 36,000 homes and 53,000 residents. So, again, planned development carried out. There's the railway station. Chinese interest again. Here this is developers actually competing with Australian developers for sites very effectively. So quite a lot of international demand. So in terms of the housing diversity outcome, not quite as diverse as you might hope. Green squares, primarily flats and apartments. Rouse Hill, even more than the rest of Sydney, is primarily detached homes. This is sort of the two of them side by side. In terms of the affordability outcomes, and of course supply is supposed to deliver affordability, even more disappointing. Mortgages and rents in both places are higher than Sydney overall. Perhaps that reflects the demand effect of well-planned areas with, good public infrastructure and attractive urban spaces. In terms of dedicated affordable homes, and remember these are state-planned developments, much using government land as well as investment in public infrastructure and in talent, in planning. The affordable housing outcomes in Green Square, which is the sort of the larger development, it's about 1%. So not really very high, none at all in Rouse Hill. So that's quite disappointing. And the other dots around Sydney have got a fairly similar story, aside from the fact there's been no affordable homes delivered in those. So just looking at the reforms just briefly for a moment as well on the subject of whether planning is a supply constraint. The metropolitan strategies for Sydney set out annual targets for Sydney to meet for housing supply. And so 2005, the target was 25,600 per year, and it's increased now to about 33,000 per year. Those are the targets. Now, to meet the targets, we have the spatial strategies, which I've just described, but we've also had a series of very, very deep and radical planning reforms to unlock the barriers. And I want to share a couple of them with you. But note, most of the reforms were implemented between 2005 to 2011. And then there was a sort of a resistance, a rejection of the reform agenda and a sort of clawing back. So the reforms paused. They weren't dismantled. They were wound back a little bit, sort of paused in 2011. The first one was basically an approve anything, irrespective of local controls, as long as it's very valuable and involves a lot of housing units. It's the major projects legislation. Another one was around releasing land pretty much everywhere, rezoning rapidly, and standardising all local plans, so you don't have any little idiosyncrasies. I won't talk about the depoliticising decision-making, but that was essentially taking out local authorities from the discretionary planning process and replacing them with experts. And we did have a very small affordable housing reform, which was an incentive for our developers to include affordable housing in return for a density bonus. So the major projects one is probably the most interesting because it really shows you what you will get if you just wipe out the planning system, at least for really big projects. So my research associate, Catherine Gilbert, analysed all of the applications for under the major projects legislation, residential applications. Out of 80 applications, 77 of them were approved for nearly 40,000 dwellings. So it's quite a significant reform. A third of them wouldn't have been permissible at all, full stop. And most of them wanted to be much denser than the planning controls would have allowed. In almost half of them, the councils would not have approved and lodged strenuous objections to them being approved. In terms of whether we got any affordable outcomes for this, actually just a transfer of wealth, really, because it's a massive upzoning and the issuing of planning permissions. 0.5% of the 40,000 dwellings that were approved were affordable. And in many cases, the applications actually resulted in a net loss of affordable dwellings because they were redevelopment of affordable housing sites. And, if you're going to make money when you redevelop a public housing site, apparently you don't include much affordable housing in it. So that's one set of reforms. Another set was just making sure there's enough land. There probably was to start with, but there certainly is now more than 16 years supply ready to go, just sitting there, waiting there. In terms of the affordable housing reform, this reform gives a density bonus. Now, whether you need a density bonus when you can just go and ask for permission anyway to do something of very high density and you don't have to include affordable housing is a moot point. Density bonus for affordable housing inclusion, but some other things which I think are actually quite virtuous and worth replicating, and that is if local communities object to the affordable housing, there's an override provision which makes it clear you can go ahead with it. And some codification of particular dwelling types like accessory dwellings, which we call in Australia granny flats, and they are basically allowing you to put little dwelling unit in your suburban backyard, put grandma in it, put annoying teenager in it, or rent it out to, to another family. That has been the most successful of the affordable rental housing reforms and the only one actually that the government is reporting on. Because of the codification, we saw builders develop this fabulous prefabrication technology, and so they can, you can put a granny flat on very, very cheaply. They market this to homeowners and landlords, even to Chinese landlords, in fact, as a really great way to make money. And so in terms of a supply outcome, this has been great guns. 10% of Sydney's dwelling supply last year was that. So there you go. But if you scratch and ask what kind of housing is being delivered and is it appropriate and is it what we want when we say we want an affordable housing outcome, I don't know. I've got a project looking at that at the moment. But, just a simple trawl of the online advertisements is not very encouraging, I'd have to say. Now, if we just look at what those reforms delivered in terms of a responsive planning system able to meet those targets set by state government. So the red line is the housing target. This is the demographically defined target. Planners say we need 25,600 dwellings per year to meet Sydney's projected household formation. That's the red line. The yellow line is the actual performance in terms of the supply of planning approvals. Now, industry look at that and they say, planners, big fail, you are missing the mark, you are missing the target by a long way. And that is the supply problem right there. But the benefit of a few years and adding some market information, and the market information is the green line if you can see it, that's what Sydney house prices were actually doing. You can see that the flat building planning applications, residential development applications and approvals actually mirrored a very flat housing market. Not a housing market that was falling, but a housing market that on the back of a 10-year boom and in the middle of the global financial crisis just decided to stay still. Now, as soon as the housing market began to rise and we had very, very low interest rates, I've got another graph that just shows house prices and interest rates, so too did housing approvals. That, to me, without doing any, complicated modelling, I think you go to LSE and your colleagues over there for complicated modelling, that looks like a responsive planning system to me. The other indicator, to my mind, is actually the supply and the stock of planning approvals. Because really, as planners, we don't go out there and build the houses ourselves. All we do is issue the supply of consents. And so in Sydney, what you see housing consents doing is actually, over the whole period, staying pretty steady. So the black line is the number of inactive consents. So people have got approval, they're not ready to go ahead and build it. What changes in response to the market is the flow of applications and the flow of completions. So completions are the yellow, those are units that are completed. So as units are completed, more applications come forward for new homes to be built. Again, to my mind, that is a fairly stable scenario. But what it shows is that the power of housing supply is not with the planners issuing consent, it's with the private sector. And that's what we've transferred in Australia. So the last question then, because we've still got a chronic housing affordability problem in Australia, the last problem then is it really a political problem rather than a planning problem? And we know from the literature that housing policy as urban policy and planning is a very contested politics. We've got a politics of production, of housing developers, of house builders. We've got a very complicated politics of consumption, of homeowners who see their wealth vested in their home, and of tenants who, often their interests are quite different to homeowners and property investors. We've got a politics, at least in Australia, between levels of government, the Commonwealth, who has macroeconomic interests in making sure there's employment in construction, in house building, and wealth stored in homes, and there's stability there. But we've also got local politics of not wanting a development that is not in keeping with neighbourhoods and community wellbeing. There's a politics in Australia of desired urban form, a very intense one, against densification in many cases. But also, and I don't know if this exists in the UK, but certainly in Australia, an ideological contest between whether planning as an intervention in the private market should be there at all. And this quote from one of our senators, who actually heads up one of the largest house building companies in Australia, but he's a senator at the federal level. This quote sort of illustrates, to my mind, that ideological contest between planning and the market. And he blames the ideological dreams of urban planners for the loss of for the falling dream of home ownership. He actually goes on to blame planners as well for denying him of a grandchild, because all of his daughters and daughters-in-law are going out to work instead of to pay off the mortgage. But anyway, so we could say it's a planning problem, or we could say perhaps it's the financialisation of housing. Housing has become an asset rather than something that you live in and you value to live in. And certainly this chart, which shows in the mid-1980s, 90% of home loans were for owner-occupiers. Here we are in 2016, and around about 40% of loans are for owner-occupiers. So there's a real financialisation of the housing market, and of course that deeply affects the politics. So the literature tells us then actually that social problems like housing affordability crisis is actually socially constructed, and there's also a process of social construction, of self-serving often, social construction of the policy solutions as well. And there's been some really interesting analyses of the New Zealand scenario, which is like Australia but even more dramatic. In fact, their politicians in New Zealand liken planning to constipation. And they prescribe a laxative to the system. Well, anyway, that's a whole other discourse. But we've also got a very intense politics around lobbying. And my colleague Peter Phibbs and I looked at this whole idea in terms of theories of policy capture and analysed our housing problems. We were greatly frustrated actually by a decade of research which demonstrated really if you want to solve the problem of there not being enough affordable homes in Australia, you need to fund your affordable housing sector. It's pretty bloody obvious. And we, in a bit of frustration, applied the theory of policy capture to understand how these particular interests have used tactics that actually are very transparent in Australia. I mean, you see a lot of lobbying, you see a lot of political donations. The housing developers and the land developers and the main political donors in Australia. You see people threatening to protest, revolving doors, so our politicians are often headed up the Property Council. I'll show you one in a moment. And our think tanks, certainly in Australia, really are there to generate distorted evidence, and they have much bigger budgets than universities. So the Property Council in Australia has essentially shaped our debate, a recent debate in the federal election, actually about whether negative gearing, which is a tax break for property incentives, should be wound back and applied only to new homes. And Property Council invested millions of dollars in an ad that was televised nationally, but likened Australia's housing market to a fragile house of cards. And of course, playing on the fears of overly indebted homeowners, that any change to the status quo might make that housing market collapse, but also to the fears of property investors. And our Conservative politicians leapt on this. In fact, our Treasurer used to be head of research for the Property Council of Australia, but the Conservative politicians managed to argue both sides of the debate. They managed to argue that reducing tax breaks for property investors would make housing more expensive. This is one of them. And the other one was arguing it will actually make the price of houses fall. And anyway, whichever way you looked at it, it was pretty scary. That's the policy of fear. And when you actually look at the structures of wealth in Australia, you understand why that type of campaign is so effective, because most Australians' wealth is vested in home ownership, and people who are homeowners and live in owner occupation are much, much wealthier than tenants. The homeowners are about the only ones actually who defend the poor old planning system. And so just to wrap things up, this is a local group. Remember I said by about 2011, which ironically was when houses began to be built again in New South Wales, the planning reform agenda stalled. And it stalled because of angry homeowners, angry residents, saying they don't want any more development plonked in their neighbourhood that was completely inconsistent with local planning. Now, our planning minister of the time was named Brad Hazzard, and this group commissioned Hazard tape, and they literally captured him. And this theory of policy capture, regulatory capture, actually came true here when they captured the planning minister in Hazard tape and halted the reforms, did not halt house building, but halted the reforms. So the community don't blame planning for house prices, they blame the Chinese. To have someone to blame. Ironically, our problem in Australia is no longer an undersupply of housing, nor is it a problem of restrictive planning control that's not allowing apartments or flats. We've just got too many now. So our problem is one of oversupply. That would be okay if oversupply was actually making rents cheaper, for instance, but it's not. And some work I'm doing at the moment is looking at the share housing sector. And clearly the problem that we really have in Australia is a problem of way too many homes at the top for too few people, in the words of Danny Dorling, and too few homes at the bottom for too many people. I mean, this is if anyone wants to move to Sydney, students, here you can share with only 4 people in this living room. They need one more person. Very nice place to live in central Sydney. So what might you learn from the really rather sorry story of Australia? Inherently, in Australia, we've got a market-driven system. And so, if you're looking to marketise, if there is a convergence happening amongst housing systems and England is heading towards marketisation, there are very few policy solutions, policy interventions that you can do once you're very dependent on the market. I think in favour of our planning system, we do overcome local constraints, and actually I think that's a good thing. I'm not in favour of local communities being able to prevent housing development that's appropriate and that serves local needs, and we do that effectively, I think. But I don't want to apologise in any way for our planning system, because what we do is we surrender public benefit in that process. So we're using We're investing heavily in public infrastructure, in talent. It's a public decision-making process. And the public benefits that we're seeing out of our urban development process, I would argue, are very small. And there's no real political momentum to change this, what I think is a very unfair system, because still most Australians live in their own home and are not affected and in fact probably benefit from the status quo. So what our planning system is doing wrong is not actually blocking supply, but is reinforcing this spatial sorting of wealth that we're seeing in Australian cities by allowing the benefits of good planning and infrastructure investment to be captured and enjoyed by existing homeowners and property investors rather than sharing them more widely.
Long Wu and I were in a session with Jeremy Peck last week, and he described the world as fantastically bleak at the moment.
Wow.
And I'm sort of wondering whether that's a good description of what you've just described in Australia. So what we have now is an opportunity for some questions and discussion. There's clearly some resonances with the story in the UK. And perhaps through discussion we could tease some of those out. So, who wants to ask the first question? Nick?
Oh, sorry. Affordable housing, I think when you were talking about Rouse Hill, was it Rouse Hill, the 103 affordable homes?
Oh no, that's Green Squared. Zero in Rouse Hill.
What is affordable housing?
Okay, that's a good question. So affordable housing is basically rental. We have very little affordable home ownership, only in one state. The definition is changing, but the green square is actually affordable in perpetuity and the rents are tagged to the resident's income. But under the planning system, so the incentive scheme for affordable housing, if you want to get a density bonus, or in fact forevermore now, if you're getting any affordable housing out of the planning system, the definition is 20% market discount for 10 years. After that, it's yours. No need to discount.
So, I mean, the solution in England, if you've got a supply problem in affordable housing, the thing to do is change your definition of affordable housing. So, for example, you've delivered 1% out of the 10,000. I would imagine that the response in the UK would be to, rather than pay for the 100 homes, to discount the price of the other 10,000 by 1%, and then call them discount marketing, ACCA affordable housing. That's it. I mean, is there some movement in that direction?
No, there actually isn't. I mean, we're in the difficult position of saying that that would actually be progress. I mean, we don't have capital funding. There's very, very minimal amounts of capital funding for social housing supply, and because our non-profit housing sector is so tiny as well, it's trying to leverage its small assets, but you know, essentially there's not a non-profit sector that's able to act as a developer. So what the planning system can deliver in those circumstances when there's no funding stream for capital development, I think, is smaller than what you might be able to achieve in England. And it might actually be affordable home ownership. But no, we haven't gone there. All the argument is if you make them very tiny, or if you don't require car parking, then the discount, and there's no requirement actually for the developer to apply the price discount, but the discount should again be a market solution. And there's no, if you're thinking of that, there's no evidence that that works.
Yes. Nicole.
Thanks very much, Nicole. One thing I wasn't quite clear about was the role of the developers themselves in constraining supply.
Yeah.
The current scarcity value, particularly here in the UK. I wondered if you could just...
I mean, look, I think that's the new research frontier. We have very little research on, you know, the development industry in Australia, how it's operating. I mean, the development industry keeps that very secretive. What we do know is that there's a lot of trading of sites with permissions without the sites actually being built. And generally what happens when you buy a site with permission to do something is that you then apply to do something more than you applied last time. So there's that. Certainly that goes on anecdotally in all Australian cities. The other issue is that if your site has permission to build, 50 stories and it's not viable, it doesn't make any economic sense to build now at 20 stories when your hypothetical value of your site is at 50 stories. And because in Australia planners internalised this idea that, the planning system was the constraint, we've gone through a decade of basically upzoning and permitting anything that you could possibly imagine. And what that has done, I think, has quarantined a lot of sites that won't be viable until probably the next boom. But I don't have hard evidence, but I think that would be my analysis.
Just a clarification question, because you said in the beginning that in Australia you have a land speculation system, whereas in England you have a housing speculation.
Well, that's, I imagine, yeah.
So I was trying to understand how this land speculation works. So do developers prepare the plots and then sell the plots, which are then developed by the people who own them?
Yes.
And so you might have a glut of developed plots not sold, but you
Yes.
can have a glut of development plots sold to people, but which
Yes.
then don't build their houses on.
Yes, exactly that. That is it, exactly. And just what I described to Iqbal. So the developers, will have a very valuable site. And on paper, the value is even higher because it might have a planning permission or it might have zoning to, do something that the local market is not ready for. And so that's the value. The developer has made its money in buying the site cheaply, getting it rezoned or getting permission for, something big, then they sell it, maybe even to a Chinese developer. I mean, actually, Chinese developers don't seem to have the finance issues that local builders have. But what I mean by contracted housing provision is the actual housing developer can't finance the apartments or even the detached dwellings without a contract of sale for the end buyer. You can get apartments up with 75% of pre-sales. Sometimes it might be tighter, and certainly in the context of the
Is that a
GFC.
legal imposition or is that a market analysis of how
It's a market analysis. It's a prudential. That is the mortgage. That's how the mortgage market, the development finance works. Is they won't finance the developers without the developers having the contract, and the contract involves quite a hefty deposit. So the homeowner would pay, say, $50,000 on a $450,000 apartment, and then wait 2 years.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture.
Thank you.
You mentioned the financialisation.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say a little bit more on it? Particularly, is it the oversupply of apartment housing?
Mm-hmm.
Is any associated financial risk?
We don't know. I mean, that is, again, this is new. The fact that, it's deeply, deeply annoying because, planners and, probably me have been saying for a decade oversupply is a problem that we don't want to have, so it's really, really annoying. We've never gotten into this problem before because of the contracted system of house building. We've had gluts of land. It's not a problem to have fields on the edge of the city that are vacant, but it is a problem to have an oversupply of housing units. So, but we don't know. It will become an oversupply if we, as we know, what causes housing markets to crash is another financial shock. So if we have a financial shock in Australia, or if foreign ownership, which is relatively new as a large proportion of the new stock. Now, I saw an estimate that last year maybe 20% of the new housing supply in Sydney has been purchased by Chinese buyers. Now that's not ginormous, it's not insignificant at all, but it's, I wouldn't rate that as ginormous, and that would only be the last year, for instance. Before that would have been less, so it's been growing. So I think the answer is we don't know. It will be a financial risk if something else goes wrong in the economy. But because they're investor houses, again, investors can just sell. That will cause the housing market to collapse a little bit, but owner-occupiers will still have to stay in their homes. So you'll only see a mass housing market collapse if owner-occupiers can no longer afford their mortgages. And there's quite a bit of research to show that people will go without food, without trips to the doctor, you know, they won't drive anywhere in order to meet their mortgage payments. So, you know.
Yeah. What is the degree of oversupply? You've been talking about.
That's why I say we won't know.
So,
I don't think, I mean, look, if there's a housing economist in the room, please speak up now.
my question.
Oh, sorry.
Well, if you are talking of oversupply,
Yeah.
surely you must be able to say that, okay, this is the housing stock, this is the demand, and the difference will be the oversupply.
That is a planner's view of the world, isn't it?
Right. So it appears to be either hypothetical and not real. And then one thing, now, if you leave housing supply to the market, that is exactly what you are going to get. And I've
Exactly.
always been arguing,
That's right.
well, the market is not meant to solve social problems. The market is for allocation of resources, right? And resources will be allocated to the highest bidder. So the housing developer is there to make money. As simple as
Exactly.
that.
I think that's
Now,
right.
instead of doing this and that, my main problem is there any will, as you said, is there any will for society to resolve the housing problem? That is the first question. Will the lobby group allow that to happen? That's another thing. Why is it not the government step in and to provide the housing for those who cannot afford?
Right, I think you've got three questions out there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, well, the conclusion that I've come to is that it's a political decision not to intervene to support a non-profit housing sector. Now, if the politics change, that will be a decision, you know, it will be a political decision. But I don't think you can resolve the problem of allocation through the market. And I think Australia is a really good case that, you know, it just doesn't happen. You get overcrowding, inadequate, unacceptable housing conditions at the bottom, and, you know, a surplus at the top. But the notion of oversupply, well, you can define that as a planner, and you'd say you've got oversupply if you've got more homes than households would be oversupply, allowing for second home ownership or whatever the society can afford. But from an economic perspective, you've only got an oversupply when you don't have buyers or renters. And that, you only know that when the market drops. And they didn't have an oversupply in Ireland until the economy collapsed, would be what I would say to that.
Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I was going to ask if you think having a policy requirement for affordable housing could work for Australia, similar to what we have in the London plan, requiring 35% subject to viability.
Yes.
But then I understand the definition of affordable housing is completely different to what we have in the UK. Is that
Well,
something that could be?
Yes, absolutely, and it should be. And you know, this is why, you know, my colleague and I are so frustrated, because it's absolutely obvious. You know, I mean, you're creating a huge amount of value with planning decisions, and you know, we require roads, you know, we require footpaths and paths. You know, it's obvious that you should be requiring affordable housing. Could the market sustain 35% without capital grant and without the type of rental subsidy that you have in the UK? Probably not. But we'd be doing a lot better if we simply required. And the definition of affordable housing, again, that's political. And I think it's crazy in New South Wales that we have this tiny, narrow definition. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So all of those things are political decisions, actually. And I think they actually have really simple solutions.
I saw your hand flick out, Michael. Have you withdrawn that?
I was going to, thank you. I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about spatial planning.
Oh, right.
About the integration of development and transport and so on. I mean, we sort of think of Western Australia, for example, as tackling the problem of housing shortage through exemplary metropolitan spatial planning, having transport spurs going out in all directions. And is that?
I'd agree with that analysis. I mean, the Western Australian government used the mining boom to finance public transport, so the extension of the rail line, which was very sensible, and they did what they called new urban development, sort of housing development around those rail lines and shopping centres, and it's quite effective. Didn't bring down the price of housing, of course, they've still got very intense housing affordability pressures there. But in the last 5 years, the Western Australian government did decide politically to address housing affordability problems, and it does now include, as part of its transit-oriented development, of some affordable housing. I mean, it's small, but it's something, you know. And yeah, I think it's effective. You know, is it on world terms? You know, it's not Hong Kong. You know, you still bloody well need a car in Perth, but it is an example that you don't see elsewhere in Australia. You know, that investment in transport. Yeah, we do. That's right.
An attempt to move in the direction of that sort of spatial planning?
Rhetorically, yes. The question will be whether the infrastructure funds are on the table. Certainly the Greater Sydney Commission does not have any budget. In Western Australia, the Western Australian Planning Commission does have a say in raising fees for infrastructure and also in where infrastructure goes. But, you know, we're not jaded yet. But the Greater Sydney Commission is meant to be an independent body of commissioners, essentially, to do metropolitan planning for Sydney. And we're not jaded yet. You know, we're still hopeful. But do they have any regulatory or budgetary powers? No.
Nick's bursting to say something else.
No.
Hang on a minute. There's someone else who wants to ask a question. You can wait it out.
I have two questions. The first one, I'm not so familiar with the urban planning in Australia. That one part is zoning and the merit-based discretionary assessment. Can you further explain this?
Okay.
And the second question is, what about the building of student accommodations in Australia?
Yeah.
Does the building of student accommodation more concentrated adjacent to the university or far away from the university according to the landmass or other things? And I heard from one of my friends studying in Australia, she said her accommodations are far away from the schools or not similar to England. So.
Okay, yeah, I can answer. The student accommodation question is actually really interesting, and there's a lot of debate about that. I don't think you guys are going to find my explanation of the planning system very interesting, at least judging by the reaction of my friends. And no one wants to hear about my book, Principles, Processes and Practices in Australian Planning. But anyway, look, has anyone seen a map with zones? You know, you've seen sort of an American zoning map that basically says what you can and can't do. And there's some controls that say how high you can go, how wide you can go, how many, dwelling units you can have, how much open space. So that's preset, that's a rule. The merit-based process is like the English thing. So we say, well, we're going to be American, we're going to say what you can and can't do, just like the Americans. But then we also recognise that every proposal is different, every site is different, and we want to think about each proposal on its merits. And that's the assessment process. And so the decision maker has the power to say, they can't permit, for instance, an abattoir, to kill animals in a residential zone, but they might be able to bend the rules a little bit, make it higher or wider or, less open space. And that's the discretionary element. And that tends to work in the favour of the developer, although the developer will argue it doesn't. Yeah. So will I just quickly answer the student housing thing? The student housing thing has become a way for developers actually to build very tiny units that are just for rent to students, rented at a very high price actually. So it's become very big real estate in the central city. And of course some students have a lot of resources and can afford to pay for that accommodation. But a lot of students are forced because of price to live a long way away. But I don't think living a long way away from the universities would be purpose-built student accommodation. That would be, whatever's available on the market.
I wonder if you could say a bit more about the politics of housing and affordability and how that intersects with the rather complex politics of immigration and also Indigenous people as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, another sorry story in Australia, of course, is our record in relation to Aboriginal Australians. They have much lower rates of home ownership. You know, I mean, that really is a different conversation, and it's not as much of an urban issue, although in sites like around the University of Sydney, the politics of housing and land for the Aboriginal community is very intense, but it's not representative of the sort of bigger story that I've been describing. It's problematic though. In terms of the immigrant community, look, I think our politicians just use xenophobia as a way to deflect, you know, from policy action. And so I don't think I think there's a confusion around foreign ownership because we've got a huge immigrant, you know, population in Sydney, thank God, because it's been very good for us economically. But I think, you know, there's a visual perception that they're foreign investors when most of them aren't. They're actually residents or citizens, you know, who are purchasing homes just like anyone else. But politicians have been quite happy to play on a xenophobia when it emerges. They do it for infrastructure as well. It's an excuse not to fund infrastructure. You just say we've got to cut immigration, you know. You blame immigrants for the fact that, you know, it's congested on the roads or on the footpath, you know. So it's sort of low politics, but it's not significant, you know, as a structural explanation.
There's two hands up, and then I'm going to let Nick up.
Oh, no, not going to let Nick up last way. So, yes, sir, you're at the back.
You mentioned the desire of Australians to have, you know, the backyard and the detached house. We've got the same problem in New Zealand, probably to a greater extent here. Do you see this changing at all, and do you see planning and policy as being able to challenge this, or is it going to be more a natural social change?
No, I do see planning policy as changing it, and in fact I'm really shocked in New Zealand because you are so resistant to it, you know. Look, the Rouse Hill development, I take my students out to Rouse Hill and they're absolute snobs, you know, and they go around, they think it's bog standard suburbia. Actually, I think it's very effective. They do have smaller backyards, and that's problematic because often with smaller backyards you get bigger houses, you know, and that's, you know, it's not right. Planners do have certain views about how people should be living. But it is a very, very effective community. You can walk everywhere. You've got great diversity for all stages of life. You know, there's employment there. There's recreation areas. And I think it does show how you can have the whole spectrum of housing within a relatively, you know, contained area. And that was planned. It was absolutely planned. I think it's a planning success. It just, you know, it's just a shame that the people who benefited from the planning success were, you know, the original property owners and investors rather than, you know, something more widely. But yes, I think good planning and design can change taste.
Yes.
You didn't say much about the negative gearing controversy in Australia. Is it something you'd wish to explain or comment on? Do you have
which one? Sorry, this one, that one.
Negative gearing.
Okay, that's this one. You've got a class. Yeah, so negative gearing essentially allows you, if you're a property investor paying mortgage interest rates, you can offset your mortgage interest rates as a loss against your entire income. So if you're a, you know, barrister or, you know, doctor and you're paying very high marginal tax rate, then you purchase a property and essentially the mortgage interest rate of your property is paid off by your tax rate. So that's this debate. And the Labor Party says most investors are buying established homes, so all that's doing is pushing up demand, because investors who know their mortgage is just going to be paid off by the taxpayer can bid more than first homeowners. And nor is it delivering new housing supply, because investors are mostly buying established homes just like everybody else. So the argument was wind it back to cool demand and target it to new homes so that it's got a supply boosting effect. I think actually the impacts of it on the market are probably overstated. I think it's inflationary like anything, any of the demand mechanisms, but not, you know, dramatically more than any of the others. And I think taking it off probably wouldn't have had a dramatic impact on the market either. You know, but it's an example of a pretty stupid policy.
Okay.
If that's scholarly enough.
Well,
direct, that's what it's like from us.
We're being booted out.
So I'm going to draw things to a close in a moment, but I think Ben would like to say something about our new end plan proposal.
Very quickly, I don't want to keep people from their wine. You may have noticed these flyers being handed out tonight. We just wanted to use this great lecture as a chance to launch our new 2-year master's degree that we're offering here, the M-Plan Spatial Planning, City Planning. Sorry, it's been a long day. And the difference this has from our existing master's programs is it's 2 years rather than 1 year. And in that extra time, we take the opportunity for more comparative study. So it's great that Nicole mentioned the value of that, including lectures here on both UK and international planning, but also the chance to spend a semester abroad, including in Australia. So we're doing a really great degree. The first students will start in September 2017, so admissions are open now. You may already have a master's course or indeed be studying on one of our existing great programs. But please do spread the word through your networks and join us for a glass of wine to toast both the great lecture and this great new degree program.
So can I just sort of end by saying thank you very much to Nicole. That was a very stimulating lecture. I think that's reflected in the range of the contributions from the floor that we've had.
Thank you.
As Ben said, you're all now very welcome to join us for a drink. Could we conclude by thanking Nicole and the commission?